There are numerous international efforts to establish governance frameworks. So for our first panel on safety and security of foundation models, diving right into the deep end fast, we welcome to the stage our moderator, Stephanie Ifayemi, Head of Policy, Partnership on AI, joined by Irene Solaiman, Head of Global Policy, Hugging Face, Professor of Computer Science, Tom Goldstein, University of Maryland, Juraj Čorba, Slovak Ministry of Investments, Regional Development, and Informatization. And we will be presumably joined online shortly by Dr. Joslyn Barnhart, Google DeepMind.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Hope you've had lots of coffee because we'll be diving right in with this session. So welcome to the first session of the day, the first panel of the day, I should say, on managing safety and security risks in foundation models. So you would have heard throughout this morning, around the world, policymakers are seeking to address concerns around AI safety in response, I think, particularly in response to the recent rapid technological advances and deployment of foundation models. So while I think that there is a significant awareness of the need for, governance mechanisms, whether that's regulatory or non-regulatory approaches, I think governments are particularly looking into their toolbox and really thinking, what types of tools should I be using within my specific jurisdiction? Within the US, we've recently, of course, seen the executive order, and before that, we saw the voluntary commitments that the White House put out, which includes, at least in the executive order, some new points around dual-use foundation models, for example. And in the EU, if you've been following the discussion around the trilogue, we know that there are many discussions around how prescriptive should requirements around foundation models should be, how prescriptive should they be, what should be left to the standards, the technical standards, and how much detail should be on the face of the bill itself. And so with that, I think as we consider these types of questions that policymakers are asking at the moment, I'm excited to bring the panelists that were introduced to this discussion to really think about, what does testing and evaluation look like? How should policymakers be thinking about approaching regulation? What is happening internationally? And how do we even dive into specific questions around open source, closed models, how should the ways in which models are developed and deployed shape the responses by policymakers? So with that, we'll dive straight in. And we have a poll, I believe, that I'm just looking at the online audience as well. Please stay engaged with us. We have a poll, and we'll release the answers at the end of the panel. But let's dive right into the questions. So Tom, I'm coming to you first. You've extensively researched adversarial attacks on large language models and have noted that even when developers fortify these models to prevent against and in response to attacks, that these defenses are often quickly broken by new revised attack strategies. So this begs the question, are successful adversarial attacks inevitable? And if so, what do you think policy implications of this are? So for example, are there some applications of models that should in fact be prohibited due to the unacceptable risks and consequences stemming from these inevitable breaches, if you do think that they are inevitable?
Yeah, so adversarial attacks refers specifically to, models very often they can be jailbroken. You can make them do things that they're not intended to do by their developers, right? Adversarial attacks refers to algorithmic approaches for generating those kinds of exploits, for generating those kinds of jailbreaks. And it turns out that machines are much better at this than people are. And very often you can jailbreak a system if you have access to an algorithmic approach for doing so. But that doesn't necessarily mean that systems are fundamentally insecure. An interesting example would be that face recognition systems can be manipulated very easily with adversarial examples. You might think that means that you can't use a face recognition system in a security critical application, but you might use face recognition, for example, to unlock your iPhone, right? So whether or not these systems are secure doesn't necessarily depend on whether or not these systems have adversarial examples. It depends a lot on how the system is used, and what precautions are taken to make sure that damage won't occur if one of these attacks is successful. So I give you an example of this. Suppose that you have a customer service chatbot that is going to communicate with the customer and ask for their social security number to validate their identity and then check whether the social security number is correct. You could give the language model access to the social security number, but an adversarial attack could be used to cause the language model to leak that PII to an unauthorized person. Or you could design the system where the customer gives their social security number to the system, and then the system can call a function that checks whether it's correct or not. Right? So there's clearly a right and a wrong way to design these systems. And at the end of the day, I think that developers just have to be aware that these kinds of exploits exist and that they're always going to continue to exist, and they have to design systems carefully to make sure that they don't lead to downstream security problems. At a high level, I think that we should think about treating the security risks of AI systems a lot of the ways that we treat security risks for other kinds of software, right? All software is porous. All software can potentially be hacked. And it's not actually clear to me from a regulatory perspective that the way that we treat AI-based software necessarily needs to be different from the way that we treat other kinds of software. It's just that the kinds of exploits that people are going to use to hack these systems are different than they are for the kinds of exploits that we find in traditional software.
Awesome. And Joslyn, why don't we bring you in online? I'd love to come to you because you, of course, have a lot of experience. You've done a lot of research in this area too. What would be your impression? Are successful adversarial attacks inevitable? And if so, what do you think the policy implications of this might be?
Yes, I mean, I obviously have less technical expertise than Tom, but I do think, I think that there's a lot of science to be done here to determine how robust these systems are going to be to potential attack. And I think, I don't think that we have silver bullets in terms of governance and policy implications yet. I think that there's just a lot of work to be done to figure out what the right balance is between, the governance approaches we need to mitigate these risks and how we also balance on the positive side, right? For every potential harm that a system can do, what are the potential benefits that come from those same capabilities and how will we begin to weigh those against each other? And so I don't think we are close to answers. I think we have many, many difficult questions that remain. Actually.
Awesome. Thanks, Joslyn. And I think that you're right, Tom. You mentioned that, this isn't the sort of, we shouldn't just be thinking about AI distinctly. There's probably a lot that we can learn from previous examples in other sectors too. So why don't we come and we stay on this trend around adversarial attacks, but we'll specifically really look at misuse now. So not necessarily adversarial attacks, but unintentional misuse as well. As foundation models grow ever more capable, Irene, do you think that there might be a threshold where the cost of their misuse outweighs the benefits of release? And specifically, I know that you sort of work on open source. What specifically should we be thinking about when we're thinking about open source release? And I know that this is a question that policymakers are really sort of thinking about at the moment.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so many thoughts that I want to break down into 4 pieces tying to what Tom and Joslyn were saying. I especially want to zoom into the context because the best way that we can understand a system is in the context of its use and how we evaluate and how we determine what that risk is, which goes into what type of system are we talking about? Is it the base model? Is it something that has been optimized for a task like a customer service chatbot and how that'll affect the risk vector? Something like a customer service chatbot for a store that only sells, for example, stuffed giraffes is just going to look really different than something that's for medical information or for healthcare that'll have more personally identifiable or that kind of level of sensitive information. So we have context, openness. This question of threshold is really, really difficult and goes to Joslyn's point on silver bullets. It's not that we don't have one yet, it's that I just don't think we'll ever have one. We're gonna have to do multi-pronged approaches to determining thresholds, to determining how we do risk landscapes. And I always make this distinction between access and openness. Open model weights can lead to folks doing querying without the kind of oversight of a platform, but a highly accessible system with an easy user interface, like a playground, can create a broader pool of potentially malicious actors and lead to the kind of jailbreaking that we're seeing for some popular language models today. And then the fourth point, if my coffee is working on me today, we were talking about open source thresholds. I'm losing it, but I promise it was really pertinent, if that helps.
Okay.
Perfect. It'll come back.
The coffee's definitely working. Don't worry, you're doing a fantastic job. But Juraj, why don't we come to you on this? Because I know that you have been heavily engaged in the EU discussion and also more widely at the international level, including at the OECD. From a regulatory perspective, how should governments be thinking about the risks in this area?
Well, the key question is, what do we know now? We don't know too much. If you take the available research, most of it comes from the private sector. We do not have too much knowledge coming from the academic sector, so it's not really independent. I think in this particular respect, it is extremely valuable that at the UK summit, the government started to look into how the governments themselves can actually find out what is happening and to get some reliable knowledge on the state of the affairs and the challenges we are facing, including the benefits, of course. Secondly, of course, regulating the open source, if we are talking about open source, is one of the biggest challenges. I mean, open source is fighting for its place under the sun, I think, since the 70s when the proprietary model of software was challenged. The proprietary model, I believe, was introduced by Bill Gates. And so it's a long tradition of free space. At the same time, from the policy-making perspective, given the possible risks and not necessarily professional standard of transparency, in comparison to proprietary models. The key question is this something that we could somehow even label as anti-systemic, or is it part of the system, or how actually to deal with it? And we have some lessons learned from the crypto, actually. There we already had this big challenge to the official financial systems and monetary systems. And it seems that the regulatory response there is to actually bring in as much as possible of the alternative world into the regulation as we know it. So let's see what happens with the open source. But I can confirm that in the EU, when it comes to the relationship between open source models and large models or general purpose AI systems, this is one of the toughest questions to be addressed. And let's see what will come out of the negotiations.
I would love to follow up.
Yeah,
I remembered. So especially zooming in on Juraj's excellent point about who's part of these conversations. We were just talking in the green room about having practitioners be part of the room, helping researchers better communicate to policymakers what is the level of access that I need to do risk mapping and also do risk mitigation. There's some great people in the audience as well here. I see Elizabeth and Peter who have been thinking a lot about this threshold question of thinking about what level of access researchers need. And around the fourth point that really ties in here is the risk landscape the unintention, that doesn't sound like a word, is just so fuzzy when we are looking at the level of harm that a potential risk could have. So an example that I often give, I used to work at OpenAI and led the stage release of GPT-2. And we thought a lot about disinformation around language generation, as we should have back in that time. And we update with time. Risks are evolving. The internet is full of, if you've spent time on the internet, you know what I'm talking about. Then what we weren't as prepared for is academic integrity. And I think that's fuzzier on whether folks who generate homework assignments, is that malicious use? Is that harmful intention? Those are the fuzzy lines that we don't, as industry, we weren't prepared enough. We don't have good feedback mechanisms. That's not to take the onus away from us. But really a data point on how we just should have been more flexible to update as risks came in.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Irene. And I think that leads nicely onto the next question. Joslyn, I'll come to you around licensing. In policy circles, there has been a lot of discussion recently around licensing requirements for developers of highly capable foundation models. Presumably, licenses would be granted and sustained through sort of safety testing. So I think there's one question around what sort of safety tests should be required, and maybe I'll come back to the panel on this one. But there is a second question around concerns that licensing the development of state-of-the-art models will make it harder for new entrants. So on those two questions, Joslyn, I know you've done a lot of thinking about what types of tests should underpin sort of the sort of safety standards that would be required for licensing potentially. And then we'll also touch on what does this mean for everyone? Sort of course, you have larger entities and then smaller entities. What might be the implications?
Yeah, great question. So I do think that licensing or certification is of the most capable frontier models is worth exploring over time. But I think at the present, we have to recognize this is an incredibly difficult task for reasons that we've already kind of hinted at in this discussion. So we have to design this careful, this carefully crafted approach in which we're minimizing these risks that we don't yet all agree on and which are constantly evolving. So obviously that is difficult in and of itself. And then we have to identify, essentially kind of what the smallest set of risks is and which models are those that are most likely to pose those risks. And should those models in some way be treated than other models that have been demonstrated over time through extensive testing, et cetera, that they could be treated with less caution. So I do think it's incredibly difficult. I think there's a few key points to note here. So, in terms of kind of market entrance, I guess, really what needs to be done here, kind of the science of evaluation and testing is going to be the same, regardless of what the kind of policy mechanisms or enforcement mechanisms are, right? And as you point to, this set of safety evaluations, any licensing or certification scheme assumes that there is some sort of set of standard safety tests that we would all engage in, we would all agree about the results and what mitigation should follow from those results. And that's true no matter what those, kind of the policy implications are. And so I think we will have to go through the process as an industry with civil society, with academics, with government to assess what those robust standards, those best practices are, and to constantly evolve them with the technology. And so, yes, there has been this, significant role that we're already kind of putting a lot of policy weight on this idea of model evaluations. How do we, before deployment, how do we evaluate our models for a certain set of risks to assess, what sorts of harms they could present to society? And we already see this within the executive order. We see this within the White House commitments. We see certain types of evaluations that are already being named. The expectation that we will assess models for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear risks, cyber risks, and even risks of self-replication, right? So I think that we are coming to really see this kind of approach of model evaluations as a really central feature here. And it's going to take a whole lot of work. I do think it is, our tendency is to act as though model evaluations or testing is this very objective thing. And I do think a key thing here is that there's just a whole lot of subjectivity that goes on in this process. We may all do the same test and disagree on the results, what they mean, how much level of risk there is, how much level of risk that we are willing to take on. And that's after we've come up with what we think, if we agree on what the best approach is to testing and soliciting those particular results and feedback, right? So I think, that's just, it's an incredibly challenging societal discussion that has to happen there. So I think that's, again, that's kind of regardless of kind of licensing, not licensing. This is just work that needs to be done. And it's very, very early days. I do think that there's a lot of efforts within industry to create these evaluations because we need to adhere to these existing external commitments. But there's a real need in academia and civil society to be actively growing this sphere of third-party evaluations, third-party evaluators. So on this point of, new market entrants, I don't think that, without this kind of set of of potential safety practices and standards, I think it's very difficult to know what the costs of any particular licensing scheme are going to be, and how prohibitive it would be to new market entrants. I don't think that we have a sense of that yet. I don't think we have a sense also of where the resourcing would be for the scheme. So I just think it's too soon to kind of make the claim that this is going to advantage one party over another. For me personally, it seems very early to make that assessment. And just one more quick point, like any scheme like this, again, we would be hoping to target a very small subset of models, those that we are, either least able to interpret or predict any potential emergent capabilities that they may have. And the question is, how do we draw the smallest circle around that subset? And we've seen, again, a number of efforts to try and do that within the White House commitments, within the EO, right? That there has been this tendency to try and define the frontier. We see this with the Frontier Model Forum, right? This term. And the intention here is to say, how can we draw the smallest circle around this set of these actors that would have increased safety responsibilities, right? At the frontier, we should expect scaled responsibility practices. That should be an expectation that we all have, right? But so again, I think we have a lot of work to do to figure out exactly how to draw that circle. Right now, we see things like, 10 to the 26 flops as though compute is proxying for risk. And obviously, that's an incredibly crude proxy. We will have to continue to reassess over time. Ultimately, what we'd like to be able to do is to say, we know that these capabilities of this training process or something about model development, this type is most likely to lead to this risk, but we are not there yet, right? So I think that is yet another area that we have a lot of work to do.
Awesome, thanks, Joslyn. And I'd like to kind of stay on this point around the areas that we don't know yet. And I think that sort of goes back to what Irene was sort of mentioning before, that there are still a lot of unknowns. And so Irene, if we come back to the idea of misuse and the point that you mentioned, that there's still a lot more work to be done to understand risk, to sort of think about taxonomies in this space. How do we even define misuse to some extent? How might that inform what you think licensing or testing might need to look like? So sort of staying on the point the points that Joslyn just made, when we sort of think about licensing requirements and the sort of evaluations that should underpin them, how should the unknowns, I think, inform the tests that we might need to put in place?
I just heavily push back on licensing as a regime, partially to Joslyn's point that we just don't have thresholds and we don't know what that circle looks like and what that undue regulatory burden could be for the competitive environment. That being said, that there's a lot that exists that can happen for base models. And then it's also what type of base model and how does that affect our risk landscape. So we talk a lot about language. The way that I'm thinking about risk for other modalities like image, audio, and video is also informed by the literature. There's just a lot around natural language processing. We just have a lot of actually peer-reviewed published work on risks and mitigations, more so than we have, for example, video generation. So that does give me pause. And on evaluations, I'm also particularly bullish on evals, but the ones that we have are kind of crap. And the standards, they just don't exist. Like the kinds of ways that we determine capability are not standardized. The way that we think about safety is, to put it lightly, violently disagreed upon in the AI community. So there's a lot of moving pieces that in the policy world, what's most relevant. I think we have to come together across these violent disagreements to understand what an appropriate threshold is, because compute is just not it. I wanted it to be. It is tangible. It can give you some signal today, but it's going to be a moving target. Parameter count is not it, and we just need to improve evals.
Yeah, one thing I'll add is just that I think we talk about regulating models and licensing models. We tend to focus on the models themselves, but from a regulatory standpoint, I think it actually makes a lot more sense to look at the use cases, because whether a model is dangerous really depends on how it's used. To borrow Irene's example, a language model that's being used to sell stuffed giraffes, that use case might just have fundamentally lower risk than using a language model to manage private information at a hospital or at a bank. I think it's really difficult to look at a model and say that this model is dangerous without knowing the specific use case. And in fact, if you look at models that exist today, we tend to really focus on the future models that are going to come out. Models that exist today are already dangerous. It's just that the use cases are really evolving. We're starting to see the level of language model abuse on social media platforms go up and up and up. We're starting to see things like spam and phishing emails, right? It's just as the use cases, as malicious use cases catch up to the technology, I think we're going to see that the existing models today can be really problematic. And so I think when we think about how to license and regulate these models, we have to make sure that we think about the use cases more than we think about the models at a high level.
Juraj, as we bring you in here, because I know you sort of pointed to wanting to respond to this too, I'll sort of merge this with your next question, which was really around the role of voluntary mechanisms, because I know that you're very heavily involved in work at the EU, which is, of course, sort of legislative. But, of course, we also have the US-EU Code of Conduct. We've seen the G7 Code of Conduct. And what role can voluntary mechanisms play? Again, particularly coming back to this point that there are so many unresolved questions, there are many moving targets. And so even when we think about the use cases, which, we understand some use cases now, but those will also need to evolve. What role can voluntary mechanisms play ensuring that there is a way for us to ensure that the mechanisms we have are able to keep pace with the technological developments and change?
Thank you, Steph. I will start by saying that, of course, all the work on the non-binding instruments or voluntary commitments is certainly valuable because it forces us to really think, be it on the global level, be it on the local level. I think what the G7 did recently with the Code of Conduct is, of course, of great relevance, not only because of the size of the group, but now we can all discuss and we can all refer to it. And there are many other instruments, of course, in place. There was a lot of discussion in the US on the relevance of the voluntary commitments made during summer, I believe, whether there could be even a legal relevance for the relevant authorities here in the US, or whether it is really just purely voluntary. So there's a lot of interesting discussions going on these non-binding instruments, but I think their relevance will very much depend also on in which jurisdiction you are based and what is the position of the jurisdiction. Of course, a position of a country which hosts the headquarters of companies or which has an extremely strong buying power is different from a mid-sized or small country, for example, like Slovakia in the middle of Europe. You have a different positions, right, in the relationship between the government and the players on the market. So different governments will have different tools and different traction there, of course, in dealing with the actors on the market. At the same time, also following up what we have discussed previously, I think the key question is whether we will end up just with using standards and some kind of a regulation that is focused on technology, as we call it, or whether we actually realize in some years that are ahead of us that we are actually dealing with the symbolic economy, that it's not about the technology so much as about a kind of universal interface that actually forms how people interact, not only with the programs or software, not only with the embodied AI in some kind of a tangible products, but also in between them and the way they relate to the outside world and to the value of things around them. So I think we may realize, no matter what type of instruments we choose, be it non-binding or binding ones, I think at the end of the journey, we may come to a point that we realize that we need also some additional mechanisms, not only those that look at the technological side of things, but we need to look at tools, public policy tools, how to actually incentivize certain behavior. And not to make this too long, I will just give you one example. From history, it took us decades or even centuries to realize that we need central banks, which entered the field by means of working with the interest rate and influencing the behavior on the market. We realized that they need to be, at least to some extent, independent from the executive, from the government. So I think I expect the very same kind of learning we will go through also in relation to these sophisticated interface tools that use the universal language, the natural language or the language of software, in order to actually command and control environment in new ways.
Thanks, Juraj. So why don't we come to accountability and how accountability might need to shift depending on the stakeholder. So also staying with this theme around sort of voluntary mechanisms and then sort of more regulatory tools. Irene, this is work that you've been doing for a long time. You've sort of been thinking and you stress the importance of different forms of enforcement mechanisms. When we sort of think about Hugging Face and other hosting platforms, what degree of responsibility do you think that hosting platforms should bear when it comes to ensuring that the AI systems hosted have the appropriate safety guardrails in place? You could also, of course, compare that to the role that other sort of companies might have who aren't sort of hosting platforms in the same way.
Yeah, we're in a fun, funky spot where there's very few organizations like Hugging Face, and it is a helpful exercise to break down who are the actors who should be accountable for what. So we talk to Tom's point, we talk a lot about models. And I use the word system to be inclusive, especially of data sets. It's really interesting. I live in many worlds, and a lot of the conversations around data I have is primarily in policy circles. And I also just have incredible colleagues who think a lot about data set work, but there's just not enough research. There's never enough research on large-scale like training data, 1 terabyte of training data. How do you evaluate that? Who's collating it? Who's responsible for that? Some open systems are trained on open data sets that are created by a different actor, and then the burden of responsibility is on them. So Hugging Face is in a spot in hosting platforms. We host hundreds of thousands of data sets and models. And a lot of what we have to think about is also prioritization. We have to think about thresholds, for example. And something that we can do, while it's important to look at context of use and use case, is for a base system, disclosure is so critical. But the level of detail in that disclosure can vary based off of the threshold that we put of the popularity of the system, which we look at the use and the downloads of a model, for example, or of a data set's use. But that's just looking at those key artifacts, and I think that is such an important question for accountability.
Tom, we'll come to you next. So there's been a lot of discussion, I think, more and more in policy circles about sort of like technical solutions and methods, and red teaming is, of course, everyone's favorite word at the moment. We don't necessarily have, I think, an agreed definition of what constitutes AI safety. I think across different jurisdictions, you'll see that AI safety is sort of defined in different ways. And even if you just take the sort of UK approach compared to the US approach, but at a granular level, are there any particular technical methods which, based on your work around vulnerabilities, that you find particularly promising? Or are there other methods that you think are potentially exaggerated, where there's a lot of discussion, but they might not respond to a lot of the harms that you sort of mentioned on the panel so far?
Yeah, so when it comes to mitigating harms, I mean, there's interesting technical solutions emerging. There's also non-technical solutions, and there's things that sort of are in between. Actually, rolling back, saying a few things about the last question you asked about accountability. One thing that I think is important is that organizations that are hosting models need to do platform moderation. This is something that we expect of, for example, social media companies, right, to make sure that their platforms are not being used for malicious purposes or illegal purposes. I think that we also need to expect that organizations that are hosting these models as a platform need to do platform moderation. And that moderation can take place with technical tools to try to assess what is going on. That moderation can take place at the level of users, the level of scrutiny that you might apply to, say, queries from a banking organization might be different from some sort of unauthenticated user, right? From a more technical perspective, there are interesting things emerging that can be used to potentially mitigate some of the social harms of language models and of image models also. One thing that I'm interested in particular is detection of language model content and detection of generated images. And this is an issue that's become a bit I think, controversial for a number of reasons. And one of which is that I think people online tend to take these incredibly hyperbolic, this is very good or very bad type of stances on these issues. And also when it comes to language model detection, I think there's been a lot of irresponsible product releases. You get these tools like GPT-0 where people are just sprinting to get some sort of language model detection tool online to have the first product in the marketplace. And the products that they're releasing are just irresponsible garbage. And they have a lot of negative social implications. And so this issue of language model detection, I think people think of it now as it's sort of a throwaway item. It's something that high school teachers use to keep their students from cheating, but it's not clear how socially important that is. And all of these systems are incredibly inaccurate. But actually, the state of the art in language model detection has come really far. And today, there actually are very good language model detection systems that can detect most language model use cases with a false positive rate of about 1 in 10,000. And I think that developing these systems is actually really important for things like social media platforms. If you want to do platform moderation in a world where you're inundated with all sorts of language model abuse and all sorts of fake images, if you want to be able to do moderation, you really have to have these kinds of tools available. And so I think this idea that these tools are fundamentally inaccurate or these tools aren't very important and high schools need to learn to just move beyond this, I think that this is a really oversimplified narrative. And I think that we, as an academic, I think that we need to do more research in this area, and as the tools improve, we need to do a good job communicating to people what tools are out there and what their benefits and limitations are, and hopefully push this area forward. And then a related area is also watermarking, also a bit of a controversial issue. I personally think that as watermarking technology has progressed incredibly fast over the last few months, and we're at the point now where we can embed watermarks in language models and image generators that really don't degrade the usability of the model at all. And I think that it's a good time to consider having a consortium where platforms might embed some sort of watermark and then provide limited access to it to certain organizations, for example, social media companies, organizations like Amazon that don't want to be inundated with fake LLM reviews, right? Have like a limited number of partners that can use those watermarks in order to make sure that everyone is working together, so that some of the potential downstream harms can be mitigated.
Thanks, Tom. And I think that's a good example there, sort of thinking about watermarking, because the next question is for Joslyn, sort of thinking about the role of the public. We, of course, have talked about education, and there's, of course, an aspect around public education. But when we sort of think about enforcement mechanisms or technical approaches, or when we think about disclosure or watermarking or more widely, what forms of enforcement mechanism, when we think about the public and having them engaged and informed, do you think that we should be prioritizing? So either in the form of institutional governance or in the form of technical approaches, what do you think we should be really prioritizing to ensure that the public are engaged, and we're also maybe responding to some public discussion and debate as well?
Yeah, to make sure the public is engaged, I mean, I think that's just a really challenging question, right? I think it's an open question. If we have some sort of belief that these should be societal discussions, this goes back to just standard political questions. How do we incorporate all of these disparate beliefs into some set of shared policy views that industry can then implement? And that is just an incredibly complicated chain, obviously. So I think that you have governments that are intended to act upon public interest. And I think over the last 6 months or so, we have seen governments around the world that have started to take up these exact issues. I think that they sense some expectations on the part of the public here. I think they sense a desire on the part of industry here to make some connection between what industry practice should be and what is in the best interest of the public. So I think that, policymakers have clear responsibilities here, clear jobs to do to help provide clarity here. And I think that, the US AI Safety Institute, the UK AI Safety Institute, I think we have lots of, intentions, aims of doing this, obviously within the EU as well. And so I think, that is just a key component here, is having open dialogues across these channels so that we can start to really capture what it is that we should be inputting into these systems. I do think a key element. You asked about the institutional and the technical, right? I think that we have these technical tasks that we kind of are identifying, right? I think that ensuring that appropriate amounts of resources are being contributed to, or even a fraction of the resources are attributed to technical safety mitigations, as are contributed to the capabilities that we are creating. And I think that altering that sort of dynamic is key. I think government also can play a key role here in incentivizing the amount of expenditure within safety itself, both technical and institutional. On the institutional front, I mean, I think that we see. Again, I'm back to this, lots of efforts right now across the board to embed institutions and create institutions that can hopefully, safety is not just technical, it is obviously institutional. These two things absolutely complement each other. You can create a technical solution in a vacuum, but then you require strong institutions to be able to diffuse those technical mitigations, right? So I think that we have to be developing both of these things at the same time if we are to get the right practices and standards to all of the relevant actors in the amount of time that we need to. So I think, yes, we may say voluntary mitigations are not sufficient in the long run. I think it's given that it's what we have at the moment. I think that it is also in industry's interest and to essentially move forward with this. Industry has no interest in developing things that only then need to be retrofitted according to some other set of standards that are developed at some future time. So I really think that there's just strong interest all around to identify, to build these institutions, and to also invest in these technical standards that we need. And then, of course, I think that it is onus is on industry to make sure that they are sufficiently implementing these standards. And then you get to these internal governance, approaches that we're also going to need to make sure are very robust.
Awesome. Thank you, Joslyn. And with that, we will be coming to Q&A in a second, so please have questions prepared. Also, the online audience will be taking questions online too. I'm going to try to attempt to read out the poll question results that we received. So the poll question was about a French AI startup that had released an open source language model that can provide detailed instructions, apparently for suicide, killing of one's spouse, and acquiring Class A drugs. I'm looking at the Future Society team for the question that they've put here to start the conference. Which of the following responsibilities should apply to the developers? And you had 4 options, or you could include your own response at the end. And the highest sort of rated response here is that the startup should actively monitor and attempt to police all modified versions of the model for harmful content, instead of the other options being that they should bear no responsibility for the open source model, that they should implement some form of content moderation within the original code, or that they should publish ethical guidelines for using and modifying. So just to flag there, that they should actively monitor and attempt to police all modified versions of the model was the response. So thanks to everyone that came back on that poll. And with that, we will come to Q&A. So I'm hoping that this is a nice way to start the day with, I think, what we have provided is a really good sort of basis for many of the problem statements and challenges and risks in this space. But I think we've also started to identify some of the solutions, both technical and institutional. So I'm looking for hands. Why don't we start at the front here?
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Simon Campos, CEO of Safer AI doing AI risk management. My main question is, will the cost of releasing model in open weights ever exceed the benefits? And if so, when do you think so? Yeah, I'd be curious to hear the take of Irene and other panelists on this.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
We'll try and take 2 or 3 questions just for time's sake.
Hi, I'm Katie Gilligan. I'm a developing trustworthy AI systems fellow here at GW. My question is thinking about the both mandatory and voluntary schemes that we've talked about today. Where do you place that in the development process? So like the legacy way to think about it has been, we'll build a system and then we'll test or validate or license at the end. And some more current ways to think about it are things like threat modeling or shifting security left in the process. Where do you really see the most optimal way to build security and build trust into these systems?
Okay, and then the last question, just there, please.
Thank you. So my question is, like, we spoke a lot about context and the relevant, like, importance of context in evaluation, which I totally agree with. But do you imagine that as a community we could agree on maybe a basic set of more universal metrics that we think that the base model should be evaluated for, things that are more universal, more objective, more possibly technical? So I could think of maybe distributional and representational issues, things that are like should be tested also at the level of the data, versus the more context-specific, application-specific that will need to be tested more, like misuse, etc. So that's me.
Awesome, perfect. So actually, why don't we start with this last question about what should be sort of tested at the sort of base model, and then I think that we can also tie that to the second question about security steps and processes sort of along the entire development cycle. Irene, why don't we start with you first?
Yeah, oh my goodness, okay. Oh, hello. Yes, because I feel very strongly about this question around evals, because I think part of what has happened in the eval world is that what is more tangible and quantifiable has been prioritized, and that has kind of been at the detriment. I don't know if it's a direct causation, but at the detriment to more complex social aspects of systems that cannot inherently be quantified, but sometimes you need to quantify them in order to get to mitigations. So I worry about the level of disparate resourcing we have to different risks. This is part of the violent disagreement on what is safety, and I think this is part of where a lot of just fuzziness around issues like representational harms and bias comes in, is that we will never be at zero. It's just impossible to have a fully unbiased system. That doesn't mean that's not something that we can work towards mitigation of, for example, stereotypes. But I worry that if we're anchoring on looking explicitly at base models, you can't possibly taxonomize all possible use cases and figure out how to quantify them, that we need to understand prioritization of the issue areas. I've been working with an incredible crew across sectors on a framework for social impact evaluations, looking at what already exists. And I've seen this movement towards what is more representation. Representation matters when you're looking at bias, for example. We just have a lot more evals around gender, and a lot of that's around the binary, and that's very quantifiable, but it's not often representative of like the world.
Awesome. Why don't we come to you next, Tom? And then I know we're sort of timing out, so let's keep answers short. But thanks. Tom, we'll come to you.
Sorry, I'll try to be really quick. But I think historically the benchmarks we have for language models are these sort of generic benchmarks that are meant to evaluate the model on some pie-in-the-sky holistic level. But as models get better and better, these benchmarks have become basically meaningless. And the only difference between the models is really which model you choose is really going to depend on your specific use case. And I think as we move forward, we're going to see a lot of firms, they're in-house or outsourcing, building specific benchmarks and metrics that really measure how well a model performs in specific use cases, and also with respect to specific distributions of inputs that are provided by specific populations of users. And I think that we're very quickly getting to a place where that's the only kind of benchmark that's going to be meaningful. And that's a much more difficult and expensive kind of benchmarking, but hopefully organizations are willing to rise and meet that bar.
Awesome. For the first question then, I think we'll come to both Joslyn and Juraj, and I think that this is an important one, which we've kind of touched on the panel, but open source has many important components, including for open science, for innovation, and so this question about the risks outweighing the benefits, I think has pretty significant implications, and so Juraj, why don't we come to you first from a policy standpoint, right? You're really thinking about we need to drive innovation, and so open source plays an important role, but how are you thinking that vis-a-vis the risks? And then Joslyn, we'll come to you next.
Certainly, but I would point out that this is not only about open source, this can be also about proprietary models. And I remember the famous study that came out from Stanford University about foundation models, was basically actually about whether the benefits outweigh the risks of the public release. This was the main point of the study. Where we started with the notion of foundation models. But on the issue of the assessment of the risks and the weighing, the key question is, who will be the arbiters in the real world? Will it be the legislators? Quite a difficult task. Will it be the judges? Very difficult task. Will these bodies be fast enough? Given the speed, given the volumes. We don't have yet answers to all these questions, but we need to bear in mind that at the end of the day, we need some responsible people making normative judgments or value judgments so that they can be accountable to the rest of us about the public choice they make. And this is one of the major institutional challenges that we are facing in the public sector. How are we actually to design or redesign our existing institutions so that we can still keep up with the pace and make these judgments in a way that they will be done in a transparent way, and hopefully on time, if possible, so to prevent large-scale harm. So this is just my take on this.
Awesome. Thanks, Juraj. And then Joslyn, we'll give you the last word on this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what was just said. I do think, for me, I tend to be relatively risk averse. And so it's really just once you have models you're producing at the frontier with novel modalities, novel capabilities, and they are producing emergent unknown risks. This, it really seems like the onus on those frontier models should be a very high bar of responsibility before they are released open weights. And so it just seems, as was just said, like we need some sort of kind of really weighing on the side of responsibility and caution, I think, in those cases, because once the weights are out, there's no taking that back. And so I think that's incredibly difficult. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Joslyn. And with that, we've sadly come to the end. I think that I have so many questions, and I imagine that the audience has many, but sadly, we won't be able to take any more. But please continue to write in the poll. I believe the team will be capturing these questions, and we'll be returning to them throughout the 2 days that you'll have with us at the Athens Roundtable. So with that, thank you so much to the panelists for joining us today, and Joslyn online. I think we really set we dived in right into the risks, which, people usually like to start with the fun stuff, but hopefully the risks are the fun things, the difficult questions to tackle. So best of luck with the rest of the conference, and thanks again to the panelists. I'll pass back to Yolanda.